don't wind it up by mistake, because I just got one other thing to say. I've got to find it before we go. Yes, wanted to say something to my colleagues on Father Ted, but Macy Gray just came out and said a completely normal and non-abusive thing, and she is going to now probably they're going to try and destroy her life. So if that does happen, if that continues to happen, I just want to make sure that you can't pretend you didn't know about any of this stuff. You've successfully pretended that you didn't know about any of it happening to me, but you can't pretend you don't know about it happening to someone like Macy Gray or whoever comes after her. So I really hope my colleagues on the Father Ted musical will begin to speak out against this authoritarian
Graham.
movement.
I absolutely hope so too. They, as you say, they can't pretend that they didn't know what was happening now. They can see it. So now staying silent is a choice. It's a complicit choice.
Don't be the last people to say it, Don't people to be the last people to stand up, as Helen said.
Don't be the last one holding the fireball. For you, it has been a complete change of life for you. It's a complete life change.
Yeah, absolutely. And a totally different relationship with my kids, and a totally different kind of it's
everything.
It's everything.
Yeah.
And it still kind of amazes me that people, close friends, as John was for 25 years, didn't actually say, hang on a second, there's something wrong.
He was a close friend for 25 years.
Oh yeah.
I hadn't realized that. That's incredible, isn't it?
I feel like you're treated badly because you were a public figure. You couldn't just have an opinion in this. It feels like, because you had achieved so much success, because you have achieved so much success, because you're a well-known public figure, you're somehow expected to behave differently and to be allowed to have an opinion. Do you think there's some truth to that, Graham? Because there's a lot of people who have opinions about this, but you being a public figure, that's just against the rules somehow. Even
I never really thought of it like that. I mean, my thing is this: I was always very vocal about political issues and about feminism. I was heavily involved in the repeal movement and things like that. So I've always been consistent. I've always not liked things that harm women. The time I got into trouble previously was about the burqa. I personally don't like the burqa, and I don't think that a lot of women who are wearing it of their own free will. So that got me into trouble. But whatever I've gotten into trouble about, it's always been to do with women. When I defended Kathleen Moran once, I got slaughtered. And that's the worst it's ever been. It's only been when I defended women then. So it's nothing to do with anything else other than my support for women. That's all it is, really, in a crazy way. Like John Ronson, I mean, you can say a lot of things about, the most extraordinary thing to me about John Ronson is that John Ronson did a whole podcast on Michfest and talking about how Michfest was a lesbian festival, and there was a camp outside it called Camp Trans that protested it because they wouldn't let trans women into it, because of course lots of women walking around naked, men will always want a piece of that. So they set up a camp next to Michfest, and they protested to such an extent that eventually Michfest just ended. And John sets this up in his podcast as a wonderful kind of example of how a movement as Camp Trans was can exercise moderation and be kind to each other. He failed to point out that one of the Camp Trans members is now in jail for murdering 3 people who were at Michfest.
Even if he wasn't.
Can you imagine not pointing that out in that story?
It ended in a bloodbath, and you just skipped that part.
It ended in a bloodbath.
But even if he wasn't, even if they were as respectful as they could be, they're still protesting. Women just organising for themselves. Women just for one weekend being by themselves without men. Still, that's what they're protesting.
The podcast is actually quite funny, Helen, and it's worth listening to because there's a one bit where
I'll have a listen. Okay.
The full thing is so manipulative, you know. At one point,
the notebook is back. Helen's notebook of doom is back.
He talks.
Yes.
At one point, he talks about how boring old second wave feminism. He basically calls second wave feminists bigots. And then he says third wave feminism came along, and the word intersectional. He says, or intersectional feminism, and all these kind of, I can't remember, synths or violins play in the background around the world. Yeah, genuinely hilarious. But the other funny bit is when I know you have to go. I'll just say this last thing.
No, I don't have to go. I just want to celebrate Maya.
Okay. Oh yeah, no, we should. We will. Sorry, the last thing I'll say: the trans women. At one point, who was in Camp Trans, he's interviewing them, and they talk about Michfest, that the women used to all walk around topless, and it's portrayed as this kind of like, angels singing and stuff like this, and it's like, oh my God,
the violins and harps.
You were now inside the AGP experience. You were
right. It's like suddenly deeply like erotic, you know.
He doesn't even recognize what he's doing. You know, he's talking to another
that sounds
man.
Great.
He's talking to another man about getting into a place where there's loads of topless ladies.
With violins playing in the background.
John Ronson, I had to endure an obnoxious interview with him where he was slagging Graham off. Unfortunately, it was terrible. But John Ronson the whole time was positioning himself as like averse to conflict. He just doesn't like conflict. He doesn't like any kind of confrontation. I would have seen that for most of my life as very sweet. This is a guy who has suffered from bullying in his past, doesn't like bullying. It's just kind of a gentle person. And I think that's lovable and nice. But when you take it so far as to be like, anytime there's conflict, you just take the road of least resistance to avoid conflict. That's not cool. Like, he's literally trying to do a new series about how, the internet's made everybody crazy. But if he doesn't understand that if you just avoid conflict at all costs, you're actually part of the problem and not the solution.
John doesn't think he's an activist. John doesn't think he's an activist. But John is an activist. John is an activist for the other side. Because when you pretend to not notice murders, huge triple murders that happen at the end of lesbian music festivals, when you pretend not to know that the gentlemen who are going on to the her rap are men, not women.
Gentlemen.
When you pretend you can't see these issues, you are an activist. And John
absolutely, you're a tool for the wrong side when you're saying that. Like, if somebody's going to threaten conflict if you don't side with them, and your solution to that is okay, I'll just side with you, then that is activism. Yeah.
John Ronson is hilarious because he fucking talks about in one episode the satanic panic, and then he doesn't realize that he's kind of enacting the new satanic panic by going along with compelled speech and all this nonsense.
Exactly, and the teenage girls, thinking that they're really men and going through all these surgeries at great profit to men.
Right.